French in Canada and Louisiana, Part 1, The Dream of New France. Imagine a time when the map of North America was still mostly blank, a vast mystery of forests, rivers, and mountains stretching beyond imagination. The year is 1534. The world is in the age of exploration, and France, a powerful kingdom across the Atlantic, is looking for its share of the New World. The Spanish have their gold. The Portuguese have their trade routes. And now, the French want their empire, their own New France. Our story begins with Jacques Cartier, a navigator from the port city of St. Malo. Sent by King Francis I, Cartier sails west, following rumors of a northern passage to Asia. What he finds instead will shape the identity of Canada for centuries. As he sails up a majestic river, the St. Lawrence, he plants a wooden cross and claims the land for France. Before him stretch green shores, endless forests, and a land teeming with life. He names it Canada, a word he hears from the local St. Lawrence Iroquoians, meaning village or settlement. But Cartier's early attempts to colonize are met with tragedy, harsh winters, scurvy, and tension with indigenous peoples. France's dream of a northern empire nearly dies in the cold Canadian snows. Yet, the idea of New France lingers in the minds of explorers and dreamers. The French see not just land, but opportunity, fur, timber, fish, and the promise of wealth. Decades later, that dream finds new life in Samuel de Champlain, often called the father of New France. In 1608, Champlain establishes a permanent settlement on the cliffs above the St. Lawrence River, Quebec. It's not much at first, a handful of wooden buildings and a stockade, but this is where the French story in North America truly begins. Champlain isn't just an explorer, he's a diplomat, a mapmaker, and a visionary. He believes that France's presence in the New World should not be built solely on conquest but on alliance. He forms friendships with local indigenous nations, especially the Huron-Wendat people. Together, they build trade networks based on one of the most valuable commodities of the time, furs, especially beaver pelts, prized in Europe for making luxurious hats. For Champlain, these alliances aren't just about trade, they're about survival. The French are few, the wilderness is vast. They depend on indigenous knowledge, how to travel by canoe, how to survive winter, how to live off the land. In return, they bring European goods, metal tools, weapons, cloth, and beads. But this exchange goes deeper than commerce. It's cultural, even spiritual. French missionaries, the Jesuits, follow Champlain, determined to spread Christianity to indigenous peoples. Their writings, the Jesuit Relations, describe not only their missionary work but also detailed observations of native life, both fascinated and sometimes judgmental. By the mid-1600s, the heart of New France is thriving along the St. Lawrence River. Quebec and Montreal become centers of trade and religion. Canoes laden with furs glide down the river each spring, returning in autumn with supplies from France. The voyagers, French-Canadian adventurers, sing as they paddle through the waterways, braving rapids and storms for months on end. These men are the lifeblood of the fur trade, connecting far-flung trading posts that stretch deep into the interior of North America. Yet, for all its beauty, life in New France is not easy. The winters are brutal. Crops fail. Supplies from France are scarce. And there is constant tension, not only with the English colonies to the south but also among indigenous nations drawn into European rivalries. Meanwhile, French explorers continue pushing west and south. Men like Louis Joliet and Father Jacques Marquette journey down the Mississippi River, marveling at its power and promise. In 1682, René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle completes that vision, traveling from the Great Lakes down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. There, he claims the entire river basin for France and names it Louisiana in honor of King Louis XIV. From the cold forests of Canada to the steamy delta of the Mississippi, a French empire now stretches across the heart of North America. But Louisiana is not the Canada of Champlain. It's a world of swamps, alligators, and heat, a land of promise and peril. French settlers and soldiers established New Orleans in 1718, a strategic port city destined to become one of America's most vibrant cultural crossroads. Here, African slaves, French colonists, and native tribes mix in a blend of cultures, languages, and traditions that still echoes through the streets of the modern city. Back in Canada, French society takes root in a uniquely North American way. The settlers, known as habitants, live along St. Lawrence in narrow farm plots called seigneuries, stretching back from the river like ribbons. They farm the land, raise families, and build small wooden churches that still stand today. Life is simple but deeply communal. Everyone depends on everyone else, on the priest, the soldier, the trader, and the farmer. By now, the French have established a distinct identity, Catholic, French-speaking, and bound to the land. Their world is not one of bustling cities or booming commerce like in the English colonies, but one of endurance and faith. They are a people of the wilderness, defined as much by hardship as by hope. Still, France's reach in North America is fragile. The French crown controls New France directly, unlike the self-governing English colonies. Paris sends governors, bishops, and soldiers, but they are few in number. In 1663, King Louis XIV makes New France a royal colony, hoping to strengthen it. He sends the king's daughters, young women from France, to marry settlers and populate the colony. Slowly, a distinct French-Canadian society grows, rooted in family, faith, and survival. But as the population of the English colonies swells, from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, the French remain vastly outnumbered. Yet they hold strategic ground, the St. Lawrence, the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi Valley, all connected by rivers that serve as the highways of empire. For a time, it seems France might truly rule the heart of the continent. From Montreal, Jesuit missionaries push into the Great Lakes. From Detroit to Illinois, for traders and soldiers build forts, Fort Michilimackinac, Fort Niagara, Fort Detroit, Fort Chartres, each a small outpost of French civilization in the wilderness. The French name spreads across the map, Des Moines, St. Louis, Baton Rouge, Duluth, silent witnesses to this grand French adventure. And through it all, the French spirit in North America has a distinctive rhythm, adventurous yet communal, proud yet pragmatic. It's not the gold-hungry conquest of Spain, nor the mercantile expansion of England. It's a slower, more human endeavor, built on exploration, faith, and coexistence, however uneasy, with the land's first peoples. But the peace is fragile. As both the French and the English expand, their worlds collide. The fur trade, once a source of alliance, becomes a cause of rivalry. Native nations are drawn into the struggle, choosing sides in a European conflict they never asked for. War looms on the horizon, a war that will determine not just who rules these lands, but what kind of civilization will grow here. Before that storm breaks, however, the French world in North America reaches its height, a civilization of explorers, priests, and settlers who dared to carve out a life in a frozen wilderness. From Quebec to Louisiana, their legacy is written in the rivers, the towns, and the very language still spoken today. The French brought more than muskets and missionaries, they brought imagination, the dream that a distant corner of the New World could be a mirror of old France, yet something new, something uniquely American. And in that dream, in the songs of the voyagers, the prayers of the Jesuits, and the laughter of children on the banks of the St. Lawrence, the story of French America truly begins. French in Canada and Louisiana, Part 2, Empire in the Wilderness, Conflict and Conquest. By the early 1700s, the map of North America was painted in bold colors, red for Britain, blue for France, and a scattering of Spanish yellow in the south and west. But the truth was more complex than any map could show. Beyond the thin line of forts and settlements, the wilderness stretched endlessly, and within it lived hundreds of indigenous nations, each with their own alliances, rivalries, and traditions. France's empire in the New World was immense on paper, stretching from the icy shores of Newfoundland to the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, but fragile in reality. Its strength rested not in numbers but in relationships, especially with native peoples. The French depended on diplomacy and trade, while the British increasingly relied on sheer population and force. This contrast, one of cooperation versus colonization, would define the century's great struggles. Let's return to New France around 1700. Quebec is the capital, a proud city of stone churches and narrow streets. Montreal hums with fur traders and voyagers preparing for the long journey into the interior. To the south, the English colonies along the Atlantic coast are booming, their population already approaching 500,000. The French in all of Canada? Barely 15,000 souls. Yet, they hold a powerful advantage: geography. The French control the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi, the arteries of the continent. By connecting forts and missions along these rivers, they create a network that links Canada to Louisiana, a vast corridor of empire. Through it flow not armies or settlers, but traders, missionaries, and explorers. One of the most legendary among them was Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville, a bold and ruthless adventurer. In the 1690s, he sailed from Quebec to the Gulf of Mexico, founding French outposts that would become the backbone of Louisiana. His brother, Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne de Bienville, went on to found New Orleans in 1718, a city destined to become one of the jewels of French America. New Orleans was unlike any other settlement in the French world. Built on swampy ground at the edge of the Mississippi, it was a mix of ambition and insanity. Floods, mosquitoes, and disease plagued the early colonists, but its location was perfect, a gateway between the continent's interior and the sea. Soon it became a crossroads of cultures: French aristocrats, African slaves, indigenous traders, and Caribbean merchants mingled in its streets. From this melting pot, a new Creole culture emerged, a blend of French language, African rhythm, and American resilience. While Louisiana struggled to survive in the southern heat, the northern colonies of New France grew slowly but steadily. The habitants tilled their long, narrow farms along the St. Lawrence. They lived under the seigneurial system, where land was granted to seigneurs, lords, who, in turn, allowed peasants to farm it in exchange for dues and labor. Life was hard but structured, centered on family, church, and community. Above them all stood the Catholic Church, led by the Bishop of Quebec. Jesuit and Recollet priests traveled far into the wilderness, living among indigenous nations, preaching the gospel, and recording their journeys in meticulous detail. For many French Canadians, faith was not just religion, it was identity, the thread that held their society together in an unforgiving land. But faith alone couldn't stop the growing tension with the English. Both powers sought to dominate the fur trade and control the indigenous alliances that sustained it. Each new fort, each new treaty, was a move in a vast, slow-moving chess game across the continent. This rivalry erupted in a series of bloody wars, the French and Iroquois Wars, followed by the Queen Anne's War, King George's War, and finally the Great 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War. For the indigenous nations caught between these empires, the conflicts were devastating. Many tribes allied with the French, drawn by long-standing trade relations and mutual respect. The French tended to treat indigenous peoples as partners, though never as equals, while the English often saw them as obstacles to expansion. Yet others, like the powerful Iroquois Confederacy, leaned toward the English, seeking to preserve their own independence and power. As war spread, the wilderness itself became a battlefield. French and indigenous warriors used guerrilla tactics, striking quickly and disappearing into the forests. To the British colonists, these attacks were terrifying: sudden raids on frontier towns, homes burned, families taken captive. To the French and their allies, it was survival, fighting a larger, richer enemy with cunning and mobility. By the 1740s, the French Empire in North America was at its peak, but the cracks were beginning to show. The population was too small to defend such a vast territory. Supplies from France were slow. And corruption among colonial officials weakened both Louisiana and Canada. Meanwhile, the British colonies to the south were exploding in population, wealth, and ambition. The tipping point came in 1754, when a young Virginian officer named George Washington led an expedition into the Ohio Valley, territory claimed by both Britain and France. What began as a skirmish near a small French outpost, Fort Duquesne, ignited a global conflict. The 7 Years' War would stretch across continents, from Europe to India, but its spark had been struck in the North American wilderness. The early years of the war went badly for the British. The French, led by the brilliant Marquis de Montcalm, and supported by indigenous allies, won victory after victory. French forces captured British forts, ambushed columns, and raided deep into enemy territory. The French style of warfare, swift, fluid, adapted to the terrain, proved devastating. But France's success could not last. The British Empire had deeper pockets, larger armies, and a powerful navy. In 1759, the war's fate was decided at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, outside Quebec City. Montcalm and the British General James Wolfe both fell in battle, but the British emerged victorious. The city of Quebec fell, and with it, the heart of New France. 3 years later, the Treaty of Paris, 1763, ended the war. France ceded nearly all its North American territories. Canada passed to Britain. Louisiana, divided along the Mississippi, was handed partly to Spain. The grand French dream, from the snows of Quebec to the bayous of New Orleans, was shattered. For the French settlers of Canada, the news was devastating. They had fought, farmed, and preyed on this land for generations. Now they found themselves subjects of a foreign king, speaking a foreign language. Many feared they would lose their religion, their culture, and their identity. But they endured, quietly, stubbornly, as they always had. Their priests continued to preach in French, their children learned French prayers, and their songs echoed along the St. Lawrence just as before. Meanwhile, in Louisiana, the French presence persisted in a different form. The colony had been transferred to Spain, but the people remained French in spirit. When refugees from Acadia, the French settlers expelled by the British from Nova Scotia, arrived, they brought with them their traditions, their music, and their fierce independence. These exiles, the Acadians, would settle in southern Louisiana and become known as the Cajuns, a people who still carry the echoes of old France in their food, their language, and their songs. So even as France lost its empire on paper, the French soul of North America lived on, in the parishes of Quebec, in the Creole streets of New Orleans, and in the bayous where Cajun fiddlers played under the stars. The French might have lost the war, but they had left something far greater than territory, a culture that could not be conquered. The rivers still whispered French names, St. Lawrence, Montreal, Detroit, Des Moines, Baton Rouge, St. Louis. The people still spoke French in their homes, still sang their old songs, still crossed themselves before dinner. New France was gone, but the French in America were just beginning a new chapter, one of endurance, reinvention, and identity. The dream of empire had failed, but the dream of belonging, of being French in the New World, endured. French in Canada and Louisiana, Part 3, Legacy of the French in America, from Quebec to New Orleans. When the guns of the 7 Years' War fell silent in 1763, the map of North America had changed forever. France's Great Blue Empire, once stretching from the St. Lawrence to the Mississippi, was now a memory. Britain ruled Canada. Spain controlled Louisiana. And yet, despite all the treaties and new borders, the French language, faith, and spirit refused to vanish. To understand how deep the French roots ran, we must travel back to those small riverside farms of inhabitants in Quebec. Life there continued much as it always had. Families still rose before dawn to work their narrow strips of land, praying before their wooden crucifixes, guided by the local priest. British governors came and went, issuing proclamations in English that few could read, but everyday life remained stubbornly French. The British soon realized they had inherited not just land, but a people, 70,000 French-speaking Catholics who had no intention of abandoning their language or faith. Attempting to force them into English ways risked rebellion. So, in a rare act of political pragmatism, the British Parliament passed the Quebec Act of 1774. It allowed French Canadians to keep their civil law, their religion, and their language. To the French habitants, this was a victory, a promise that their way of life could endure under a foreign crown. But to the American colonists to the south, who were growing restless under British rule, the Quebec Act was infuriating. They saw it as proof that Britain was willing to favor popish tyranny over Protestant liberty. In this way, ironically, the preservation of French culture in Canada helped fuel the anger that sparked the American Revolution. While muskets flared in Boston and Philadelphia, the French Canadians largely stayed out of the fight. They had no reason to trust revolutionaries who spoke of liberty but shared little of their faith or culture. Still, a few idealists dreamed of independence, of a French-speaking republic in the north, but that vision faded quickly. Quebec remained loyal to Britain, though not exactly British in spirit. As the 1800s dawned, the French presence in North America was split in two very different worlds. In the north lay Canada, humble, rural, and bound by the Church. In the south, Louisiana, vibrant, tropical, and mixed with African, Spanish, and Caribbean influences. Let's first follow the story in the north. The French-Canadian people, isolated by language and religion, developed a powerful sense of community. The Church dominated every aspect of life, education, marriage, morality. Priests preached patience and faith, urging their parishioners to accept British rule but remain true to their heritage. Their motto became, Je me souviens, I remember. And they remembered. They remembered Champlain's dreams, the songs of the voyageurs, and the courage of the settlers who had tamed the frozen wilderness. French became not just a language but a shield, a way to resist assimilation. Over the centuries, waves of British and Irish immigrants would flood into Canada, but in Quebec, the people clung fiercely to who they were. Meanwhile, far to the south, Louisiana was changing hands again. In 1800, under pressure from Napoleon Bonaparte, Spain secretly returned the colony to France. For a brief moment, it seemed that the tricolor flag might once again fly over the Mississippi. But Napoleon had greater ambitions in Europe, and needed money. In 1803, he sold Louisiana to the young United States for $15 million in what became known as the Louisiana Purchase. Overnight, America doubled in size, and the French heritage of the Mississippi Valley became part of the United States. New Orleans, St. Louis, and Baton Rouge would now grow under the American flag, but their culture, French at its core, would never be erased. The Creoles of Louisiana, descendants of French and Spanish settlers, kept their language, cuisine, and Catholic faith alive. Their homes, with wrought iron balconies and pastel walls, lined the narrow streets of the French Quarter. Their festivals, especially Mardi Gras, blended European celebration with African rhythm. And their music, the early roots of jazz, carried the soul of a people who had survived slavery, colonialism, and war, yet still danced. At the same time, the Cajuns, descendants of the exiled Acadians from Canada, were carving out a life in the bayous and prairies of southern Louisiana. They hunted, fished, and farmed in isolation, speaking an old dialect of French mixed with English and Spanish. Their songs told of exile and endurance, their food, gumbo, jambalaya, boudin, became a living language of flavor, memory, and pride. By the mid-19th century, the French legacy in North America had become something remarkable, not an empire, but a culture of survival. In Canada, it meant preserving identity under a foreign flag. In Louisiana, it meant blending cultures into something entirely new. The 1800s also saw French culture influence the broader American identity. Explorers like Zebulon Pike and Jean Nicolet, traders like Chouteau of Asti, Louis, and missionaries across the Great Plains carried French place names and customs deep into the frontier. Cities like Detroit, Des Moines, and St. Louis thrived on French foundations. Even American law in Louisiana, with its emphasis on civil code instead of common law, remained rooted in French legal tradition, a distinction that continues to this day. But the French story in North America is not just about laws and names. It's about the persistence of a people. The French in Quebec faced constant pressure to assimilate, especially after Canada became part of the British Commonwealth. Their language was often marginalized, their culture mocked as old-fashioned. Yet generation after generation refused to give up. The 1830s saw rebellions in Lower Canada demanding self-rule. Though these uprisings failed, they planted the seeds of French-Canadian nationalism. A century later, in the 1960s, that spirit would erupt again during Quebec's Quiet Revolution, a peaceful but powerful movement that reshaped the province's identity, separating church from state and asserting a modern, confident Quebecois culture. French became not just a heritage but a declaration: we are here, and we are not going anywhere. Across the continent, in Louisiana, French persisted too, sometimes hidden, sometimes reborn. For decades, the Cajun language was discouraged in schools, considered backward. But in the late 20th century, a cultural renaissance brought it roaring back. Cajun and Creole musicians, from Zachary Richard to Clifton Chenier, filled dance halls with the sound of accordions and fiddles, singing proudly in French once more. Today, from the cobblestone streets of Old Quebec to the lively parades of New Orleans, the French legacy is alive in ways few empires could ever imagine. It lives in the food, poutine in Canada, gumbo in Louisiana. It lives in the architecture, stone churches up north, wrought iron balconies down south. It lives in the music, folk songs in the Laurentians, Zydeco in Lafayette. And it lives, most of all, in the people. The descendants of those early settlers, the voyageurs, the priests, the soldiers, the farmers, the Acadian exiles, still carry something of France, but something also profoundly American. They are not quite old world, not quite new, but a bridge between both, between the frozen forests of the north and the humid swamps of the south, between Catholic faith and democratic independence, between memory and reinvention. And so, the story of the French in America is not one of loss. It is one of transformation. France may have lost its colonies, but it won something deeper, a place in the heart of a continent. When you walk through Quebec City, you can still hear the echoes of Champlain's dream, church bells ringing over stone ramparts, voices calling out in French as they have for 4 centuries. And when you wander down Bourbon Street in New Orleans, the music, the laughter, and the scent of Cajun spice carry that same spirit, bold, joyful, and unbroken. The French gave America more than words or names. They gave it flavor, rhythm, and a sense of mystery, the idea that identity is not fixed, but a living, breathing thing that can survive conquest, adapt to new worlds, and still remain true to its roots. From the icy banks of the St. Lawrence to the sultry air of the Mississippi Delta, the French left behind not ruins, but heritage, a culture that speaks of endurance, imagination, and belonging. Centuries after the fleur-de-lis disappeared from colonial flags, it still adorns city emblems, street signs, and festival banners across North America. It's a quiet reminder that empires fall, but cultures endure. So when you hear a French phrase whispered on the wind in Montreal, or taste the spices of jambalaya in New Orleans, remember. You're hearing the echo of explorers, priests, settlers, and dreamers. The echo of New France, still alive in the heart of the New World. What are your thoughts on this topic? Let me know in the comments below. And of course, like and subscribe.